Hi, and welcome to Total Rewind, a Filmmaker's Compass podcast where we take a look at movies 30 years and older and see if they still hold up. I'm D-Man, joined by CP. CP, on this Total Rewind, I'm going to throw it over to you. Go ahead and tell us how you're doing and introduce the movie for this week's show.
Well, as D-Man said, everyone, I am CP, and I am really excited. We are continuing one of our favorite things, and we are watching an 80s classic at this point.
There's so many 80s classics,
They really are. But what makes this an 80s classic is this is one of the greatest action movies ever made. And for that reason, it is from the 80s. From 1987, the movie Predator, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, Carl Weathers, Jesse Ventura, directed by John McTiernan. I don't know how to say that.
John McTiernan. I think that's it. That also makes sense why you're wearing the attire you're in.
Yeah, this is as commando as I'm gonna get. Like,
he's all camoed out, hat, shirt, armband, ready to go.
Boom, ready to do my best against the Predator, which I will die instantly. So, just for the record, everybody.
Really quick, I wanted to say, upon rewatching Predator, and I'm not gonna lie, I actually haven't seen this movie in a while. It's been a second. One of the things that really stood out to me about the movie was how little dialogue there is. The filmmaking itself relies on the atmosphere. They do a lot of coverage shots, helicopter, they do a lot of that type stuff, and a lot of kind of people looking around, even the Predator looking around. I remember there being more, since there are so many, there's kind of iconic lines that come from this movie, but they may be as iconic as they are because so few lines were spoken.
And I think maybe that's part of the reason why, as an action movie, Predator is so memorable, because there's really not, the story's very straightforward. There's not a lot of time of dialogue and watching people do anything other than shoot guns and fight Predator. Or most of them die to Predator, but that's it. And that's kind of what we want.
Yeah, and then maybe some explosions and other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Not a whole lot else. The Predator does quite a bit of killing. Let's face it. He, literally puts objects through people. He rips people's arms off. He actually shoots things and kills people. He's quite a predator.
He's a bad dude.
Yeah.
He's a bad mamma jamma.
So in addition, then, I guess, to the lack of dialogue, I also was surprised. We got a little bit of the Jaws ambiance here. We did not see the Predator anywhere near remotely as much as I remember, or as much as we see him in other Predator sequels and kind of Alien vs. Predator and all that. He actually is seen very little here.
No, you're right. It's pretty much only the third act. The rest, it's kind of weird in the sense that Predator doesn't even really appear until, kind of a third of the way through the movie. And in that case, he's cloaked the entire time, and we don't see him because he's invisible.
Well, on that note, one of the things that's fascinating about this film, because there is so little dialogue, but there's so much action, it's actually carried by a lot of the effects. Mm-hmm. So in this case, like you mentioned, the invisibility effect of the Predator, him able to move around, and we kind of get that, I don't know what you call it, those like waves, mm-hmm. that just kind of tell us where he is. There's a great scene where he kind of walks through water.
Yeah.
And he's invisible, but the water moves, his interaction with the elements. But not only that, the kind of, the gore aspect, people getting their arms ripped off, people get shot, all kinds of things like that. I thought the effects, held up surprisingly well, because they are mostly effects from their time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess that's kind of a, simplistic statement. All effects are, but like, they weren't pushing boundaries here. I didn't feel like, so much as they were just using the tools that they had. Because there's a few movies where, like, Terminator 2, right? With the T-1000, obviously that effect was originated there, or in the Abyss, but, that they were really pushing boundaries with that. They were moving into the future of effects with that movie. Here, I didn't get that sense that they were trying to break any new ground, so much as, all right, what's in our arsenal, and let's see if we can unleash it in a fun way.
No, I agree. And I think part of that is, despite the fact that this is very much a science fiction film, I think from the filmmaker's perspective, this was first and foremost an action film set against the background of a sci-fi setting. And I think using that distinction is kind of what kept them in, let's make this be a very practical effects heavy movie in terms of blowing stuff up and shooting people up and, those type of things.
I mean, well, it's wild because, of course, if you were to make an action movie today like that, a lot of those effects would actually be CGI or they would be CGI aided. Like you might have some stuff, but you're still going to add in particles and you're still going to add in, you might enhance some effects and grade it and do all this stuff where, here, a lot of what they're doing, it's very practical. And it works, I think, to its benefit because it gives the film a sense of, grittiness. Like I remember at the end when Arnold is covered in the clay and I was thinking like, every shoot day he had to do that, and I'm thinking as a filmmaker, having, seen actors, really get into a role. I was like, I wonder if that was like uncomfortable or fun for him. I don't know. I've never heard from him, but
it's funny. I did some research on it and apparently for the cast, they said shooting Predator was the hardest movie they had ever worked on because so much of it was out in the jungle, crawling through mud with leeches. And I think I read something where the final sequence where Arnold is covered in the mud fighting the Predator took them like 3 weeks to shoot.
Yeah, that's too much.
Insane.
Like as an actor, obviously you're getting paid good money, but you got to be covered in that mud. You're wet because the conditions were wet. There's scenes where they're in water, this and that. I think, I don't know if they actually sent anyone over a waterfall, but that might have been an effect. But a good one if I can't tell. But yeah, being out in a jungle, I could imagine that taking a toll on the actors, but in a weird way, probably informing their characters because it sort of gives you that same irritable vibe it probably is to be a soldier out in the jungle.
Right.
So I don't know. I thought that all worked really well. As far as like the team goes, right? The team that's dispatched to go, investigate. It's funny because obviously Arnold is kind of the, action movie star, prototypical, super buff guy. He has that look. Obviously, he's got the iconic accent and, usually he gets the iconic lines, I think. But, as you mentioned, Carl Weathers and Jesse Ventura. So it was pretty cool to see all of them together. I don't know that there was like a massive amount of chemistry because I guess a movie I would compare it to where I thought the chemistry was great was Aliens. The second one with like Bill Paxton and they got all the characters and you're like, oh, this is a good team, like a memorable team. I think this team was more memorable because of the actors than necessarily like the on-screen interaction, but I still found it fun.
Well, on the note of acting, I think we need to acknowledge that this film is the most political movie ever made.
What?
We have two governors in the same action movie. Jesse Ventura, right. Governor of Minnesota, Arnold Schwarzenegger, governor of California. How do you get a more political movie than that, man?
Yeah, that's true. And, it's funny because I don't know if any of them knew at this time that they would even get into politics. You know what I mean? Like,
pretty funny, right?
That's wild.
I don't know. But yeah, it is weird. And what's even weirder is as a team, the team dynamic is not a big part of the story, right?
That's what I was getting at.
These guys in the jungle getting picked off kind of one at a time. The only real sort of chemistry that we even look at is this history, which between Carl Weathers' character and Arnold Schwarzenegger's character, where they have this past together.
Yeah.
Dutch feels betrayed down the line. So
I know. And then Carl Weathers comes out and he's like, I don't care. And I was like, oh, damn. Like you guys have all this history together and he trusted you to come on this mission. And now you're like, I don't really give a shit. Thought that was funny. But, something that stood out to me as well upon our conversation our pre-production meeting about this episode, you mentioned that the movie was kind of split into thirds. And this was, kind of fascinating to me when you broke it down this way, because I was like, oh, I could totally see it. So do you want to expand on that?
So first of all, aside, I think it's funny. I was doing a little research on who came up with the idea for the Predator film anyway. And I believe it's the Thomas brothers who wrote it. They had heard someone say after the release of Rocky IV that the only person who Rocky could possibly still have to fight would be an alien from another planet. And so that kind of planted the seed, and they're like, okay, like, what would this look like? This badass alien coming down to fight this macho, American fighter. And Predator was born because of that. But it's very funny because when we look at it from a story perspective, the first third of the film is a purely action movie. It is a military action movie, blowing up rebel camps, flying around in helicopters.
And I don't even know if you see the Predator.
No, I think you see his ship early on, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, they find like some wreckage or something, but
the second half is totally, or the second third, I'm sorry, totally a horror movie. It is the commando team in the jungle being hunted and stalked by the Predator. And then finally, when Arnold's the only guy left, we get the sci-fi portion of the film, which is Arnold fighting an alien. We see the alien really clearly in the final act of the film. And I always thought that was kind of an interesting thing, in the sense that the movie is three very distinct genres. And I don't think we ever think about that.
I know subconsciously I just watched the movie, but I didn't notice it. But once you brought it up, I was like, oh yeah, I could totally see it. And in that way, it's fun because it, if you were to define this as one genre, I would say action movie, hands down. And there is action throughout. But it was, now that I think about it, it is fun to see the filmmakers and the writers kind of toy around with these different genres, within a genre, and having fun that way. Because especially I think, probably the most fun section for me was the middle one where they're getting picked off. Yeah. That was the one where the Predator's like up in the tree, and we're getting kind of the infrared, that special effect where he can like see heat signatures in the jungle, and all this stuff. I don't know. I really enjoyed that section. That was probably my favorite one.
I love that scene where Bill Duke's Mac gets just like starts leveling the jungle. He picks up the minigun, and you're like,
he's like, let's go. Yeah.
I'm like,
someone's out there.
If you didn't get it then, man, I would just run, because you're not going to get it ever.
Yeah. Tough going, man. None of them really made it out for the most part. Spoiler alert. But, it's funny because in the third, you mentioned that we finally get to see the Predator. So I wanted to know, do you think the Predator himself is worthy of the icon status that it has now from this film? Was it a great introduction for the character? And, do you think the effects on the Predator, the actual costume and makeup and all that, holds up?
I think it holds up incredibly, and I think it's totally worth it. And I think they do a couple things really well in this movie. First of all, by making the Predator square off against Arnold Schwarzenegger, he's a bad dude. Yeah.
I mean, that's us bringing our baggage to the theater. But yeah, if he's squaring up with Arnold, we're like, oh, okay, here we go.
And originally, the plan for the Predator, I don't know if you knew this when you were doing your research, the original plan for the Predator was it was actually going to be Van Damme. He was supposed to be more of a martial artist, stealth type assassin.
Van Damme in martial arts? Really?
But the problem was Van Damme couldn't do the choreography he needed to do wearing the Predator suit. The other thing was, because Van Damme was a little shorter, they said he just didn't look imposing enough. So when they brought in the actor to actually play Predator, he's 7'2". So he's a big guy. They thought that
huge
brought the presence that they needed to really feel like this was
I mean, Arnold himself, he's not small. I mean, he's 6 something. I think like maybe 6'4", something like that. Like, I mean, he's a big dude, but he's not like, huge.
Mm-hmm.
Arnold next to maybe, some people in the NBA, you're like, he might still look kind of small, but for the most part, I mean, he's a pretty big dude. So, I mean, if you're going to, beat Arnold on size, you're going to have to go significantly bigger.
Yeah. So they picked Kevin Peter Hall. That was the actor. And he's significantly taller. And they thought that brought the levity to the situation. I think the other great thing is at first we don't see the Predator. Then we see the Predator with the mask. And the moment that he pulls that mask off, you're like, oh, that's crazy.
Yeah, he just drops it too. He's like, F this thing.
Yeah, because you're just like, what? Like, the mask looks so awesome. It's kind of like very reminiscent of like a Darth Vader mask. You're like, oh, I'm not going to mess with that dude. And then he pulls it off and you're like, I definitely don't want to mess with that dude with his messed up face.
Yeah, for sure. So I don't know. It's
and the puppetry is really good on the mask, the way it moves or his face moves once the mask comes off.
Yeah, he's got like the little like snarls on the edge of his mouth and like all this different stuff. It was pretty dope. I mean, what's interesting to me too, though, is that, this movie as a standalone film works on its own, but it really kind of spawned an entire franchise around this character, the Predator, who later, obviously for a while, he's the antagonist, but he's even been positioned in comics and some Alien vs. Predator and some other stuff as potentially a protagonist.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, but I think that all comes back to this initial scene. And I think one of the shortcomings in something like Predator 2 is, no disrespect to Danny Glover, but you just don't see him being able to go blow for blow with Predator the same way that we believe that Arnold could.
And he barely even makes it out.
Yeah, right.
At the very end, they have that they like repeat their lines to each other and then he blows up. But I mean, Arnold barely made it. He basically was like about to die.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, yeah, it was pretty cool to see the introduction again. Obviously, I can't say that I've seen all the Predator sequels and Alien vs. Predator. And
I have. And yeah, this is the best by far.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is, I can't speak to, where this fits in kind of the whole chronology of the franchise, but I enjoyed it. I mean, it was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
So something else I wanted to talk about is the director, John McTiernan.
Yeah.
Who would go on to direct Die Hard.
Isn't that insane?
He did Predator and Die Hard.
They're like the greatest action movies ever.
Honestly, I think Die Hard is in the conversation for the greatest.
I think probably is.
Yeah. I mean, it's up there. And I don't know, it's funny because he brings a sort of a grittiness to both, almost like, these could be real places, Nakatomi Plaza, and they're in this jungle. They feel like the way they use the environments in, where they're at, I think works really well for the screenplays. And that's something that, is never lost on me here. It really does feel like they're out in the jungle, it doesn't feel like they're on a backlot Universal pretending they're in a jungle, or, like the new Jumanji where they're against blue screens and there's a CGI jungle around them. You're like, no, I mean, it really does feel like they're out there. So I thought his kind of grittiness that he could bring, his, a lot of the practical effects and all that. But it was crazy because, he's a person that I ended up, doing a little research on prior to this episode. And I didn't realize he got into a whole bunch of like legal trouble later. It doesn't make movies anymore. I was wondering, I even dug that deep just because I was like, I wonder if he's made anything like recently.
Yeah, right. It's kind of crazy when you think about some of these epic movies he was involved with. It's also interesting. The producer on this film, Joel Silver, who went, has produced stuff like the Matrix movies, Commando, the Lethal Weapon films, again, totally instrumental in so many of the great action movies from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. This was his project as well.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. And then, of course, we got Arnold Schwarzenegger, whose career, this is, a great pit stop in his career. I don't know. What do you think for Arnold?
I mean, It's tough because I think his most iconic role is still probably the Terminator.
I think it has to be.
But I think that this has to be up there as one of his most memorable performances in a movie.
Yeah, I mean, this, like, it's so weird because even in terms of Arnold being quotable, he's very quotable in a lot of the movies that he's in. And, even something like Kindergarten Cop, stands out to me.
Who's your daddy?
Yeah. Who's your daddy and what does he do? Yeah. But here, I mean, you got another iconic Arnold line, get to the chopper.
Yeah.
Sorry for my Arnold impression. But, and then obviously we have Terminator, which is, I'll be back.
Yeah.
And, all those. I mean, Terminator is like infinitely quotable. Terminator 2 particularly.
Yeah.
There's just so many. But, I think I'd have to say for Arnold, what was his kind of pinnacle? And I'd have to say his star was shining brightest at Terminator 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably.
I mean, that's my favorite Arnold film. And yeah, I think that's when he was probably in the 90s was when he was just at the max. He was a movie star, A-list. Like Arnold was one of the biggest movie stars on the planet.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's weird because it's been a long time since I've seen Predator, since I've seen Conan the Barbarian. I've seen him, Conan, he might even have fewer lines than this.
Right.
He just walks around and looks like a badass, but it works. So something else I wanted to ask you about, and we could have done this, but we didn't. We did a total rewind, but I just wanted to get your opinion. Did you see the Predator remake?
You mean The Predator?
Yeah.
Directed by Shane Black?
Like 2016?
Yes, I did.
Do you think that was even remotely close to this?
No, and in my opinion, I think that part of the reason that what makes this movie so good is the fact that as this very much is a Jaws type experience with the Predator. We know he's there. We don't see him much. We see his effects and they're horrifying. And I think as the series progresses, we see more and more of the Predator. And I think that loses some of the allure.
Now, interestingly, do you think if you are familiar with like Alien and Predator and all that, let's say you know what they look like, maybe you have an action figure on your mantle, or your bookshelf. If you watch this movie, do you think that effect is kind of lost? This kind of like we don't see him for a majority of the film, or do you think it still works and is maximized for the story, that it makes us feel how the characters feel? Because what I'm asking is like, do you think if you're already familiar with it, right? It's kind of like watching Stranger Things season 1, and it's they're withholding what the Demogorgon looks like, and then after you see him, you're kind of like, oh, you go back, you're like, is he as scary as I imagined him to be before I didn't know? Or do you think it lives up to it?
No, I think that's a good point. And that's probably one of the other shortcomings of the later films, right? Like it's already been revealed. We know what the Predator is. And you can't do it again. Yeah. Like you can't unring that bell.
So, and then, yeah, I don't know. It's just an interesting, because kind of like Jaws, like we all are familiar with what a shark looks like. So it's not like we're all waiting, on pins and needles to see what the shark looks like. It's a great white shark, really. I get it. But, it's used to great maximum effect to create anxiety within us because, right, we don't know where it is. And there's this sense, if you've ever been in water where you're, in open water where you can't touch the bottom, you really don't know what's underneath you or what else is out there with you, and I feel like that's kind of what they were going for here in the jungle is, you're kind of like, we don't know. I mean, but, obviously going into the film, we know the Predator is an alien. How do you think all the sci-fi elements tie in here? Because I kind of thought that was maybe a little bit of a weak point. It was kind of like time travel and Terminator, like just a plot device, but doesn't really have much bearing on anything.
Yeah. I mean, and that's probably one of the biggest criticisms you can have for the film it's the story mechanism to explain how this badass dude is taking out all these commandos. Oh, he's an alien from another planet. We don't know much about the history of the predators. We don't, there's really no arc other than he shows up and starts trying to hunt people. And so I think that is a shortcoming of the film.
Yeah, right. Like they never get into, and maybe they just, the simplisticness of the story just was like, hey, let's not even bother. But we don't even know why he's there. We don't know why he's hunting these people. It's not even like he's like a monster in like the Demogorgon. He like eats them. I'm like, I don't know why he's hunting these people. There's kind of not really any exploration into the sci-fi, which, I think leaves us with more questions and also lends itself very strongly to a potential sequel.
Very true. Very true. Yeah.
But as far as it being like a standalone film, I found that to be a tad bit of a weak point where I was like, this whole sci-fi element to me felt more like a plot device than really thought out. That to me felt like something that like when we lived back in Indiana and we had a Sony Handycam, like we had access to the woods and like a Halloween store, and that would be like the type of plot that we would come up with.
Yeah, no,
like there's just this alien and he's hunting people,
Yep.
Like to me, It was like overly simplistic and didn't explain a lot. They were able to do it really well with, having the actors, the environments, and the effects really brought it to life. But the plot in that way to me was just not unique. That felt like something that like kids could come up with to me.
I can see that. There's no why. And I guess you don't need why when you're just watching.
Yeah, I mean, if you got the effects team to make him look as cool as he does, you're kind of like, I guess I don't care. But yeah, I mean, that to me was like, I could have seen us doing like a high school project or something. All these other kids are, making their story about, being depressed. And we're like, oh no, we're going to do this big action blockbuster in the woods behind CP's house. Could totally see that. Did we do something like that?
We infected.
We just might have done something like that. So,
but I don't think the audience is ever going to get to see that one. But
yeah, maybe on a throwback.
Something Thursday. Close enough happened.
I don't know. Yeah, us in the woods and a mysterious guys running around.
So, changing subject before you get the idea to release some old films here. What do you think? Does it hold up or not?
As an action film, yeah, I think it holds its place well in the 80s, particularly. As an overall like action film, I found it a little, I guess, not predictable, but kind of, I can't think of the word. I don't know. I just found it formulaic. A little bit like, hey, I liked, the conversation point that you brought up about how they're playing around in different genres. Once I was aware of that, I was like, okay, it's actually a little bit more subversive than I thought upon initial viewing. But yeah, upon me rewatching it, I was like, it's kind of goes exactly like I would think it would go. Military team gets dispatched to go handle mysterious deaths. They get picked off one by one, and there's a final showdown with an alien. I was like, no surprises there. So The action was pretty cool, though. I think it holds up. And overall, yeah, I would say the movie holds up pretty good, but it just doesn't hold like that classic status like a Terminator 2 that really kind of pushes boundaries and takes something into a totally, new experience. So I think, yeah, does it hold up among action films? I do think it does. But just in a general sense, like, is it going to be on any of my top lists? Probably not.
I think that's a good way to say it. And I agree with that. I think, is this a movie that I'm going to recommend to my mom or my sister or watch on a date? No. Is this a movie that I, got nothing to do on a Friday night? You're hanging out with some friends. Totally watch Predator.
Yeah, kind of. That was the vibe.
If you love the action genre, then you have to watch this film. I think it's near the top. If you just like movies, then maybe pass on this one.
Yeah, I think there's just so many offerings now, especially with, everything we have streaming and television that's out there. I'm like, it's a tough tough decision these days, where back in the day it was like, what's, you know, how many VHSs can you fit in a drawer with no cases, of course.
Yeah, right.
And, what's on TV and can I go to the theater? So if that was the case and in your drawer you had, Predator, I'm like, of course, that's great. But I'm like, oh shit, with all the streaming options and stuff, I don't know. It'd be tough. I'd have to maybe be with the right people, like you said, and be like, anybody down? So, but it was cool. I really enjoyed rewatching it. I hope, to all of our listeners, that if you haven't seen Predator at all or recently, that you'll get out there and give it a viewing. Obviously, we tend to say where it's at if we know, and this one is on Amazon Prime. So if you're a Prime member, you can watch it. Or if you want to go rent it, it's probably like $3 or something.
Or coming to my house, I have it on the Blu-ray.
Yeah, there you go. So everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. Let us know your thoughts. Does Predator hold up? Is it a movie that's worthy of an entire franchise to be built around? Because it is. So, and be sure to leave us 5-star review on our, comment on our podcast directories, and leave comments. Helps us boost engagement. So, CP, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Dude, Carl Weathers is actually a really good actor.
Oh,
I don't know why I'm bringing that up now, but I'm like, considering that he was like a football player and this is an action movie, he's pretty good in it. He's even better in the Rocky movies. Anyway, that's aside. On that note, thanks for hanging out and talking about Predator with us. Stay away from Predator 2 because, well, that's just the worst movie ever made. On that note, keep watching movies except for Predator 2, and we're going to see you back here next week.